Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Pathways to Healing, the Perfect Step podcast. We're your hosts, Cody Norman
and Logan Fry, process recovery specialists at the Perfect Step, also known as TPS.
We are not doctors and are not prescribing anything, as this podcast is for informational purposes and should not be considered legal advice.
We are, however, sharing knowledge and experience that we have gained from working for years with clients in the paralysis community.
The guests on this podcast include members from the paralysis community sharing their perspective and insight.
Suggestions and advice that we share may affect each person differently, as not one injury or diagnosis is the same. On this episode of Pathways to Healing, we had Doug Vincent. Doug is a polio survivor who is an amazing individual who helps people along the community.
On this episode, Doug talks about his experience in radio hosting, his time and experience with K-Frog, as well as the endless opportunities of jobs for people in the paralysis community while doing radio hosting. Stay tuned on Doug's Pathways to Healing. Welcome back, everybody, to Pathways to Healing. On today's episode, we have on Doug Vincent. Thank you, Doug, for taking your time and coming on to the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you, Doug. We really appreciate it. Doug also is the host of Walk and Roll.
Walk and Roll Live.
Yeah, Walk and Roll Live.
Awesome.
Yeah. Doug, for the guests that we have that do not know you, could you give yourself a brief little background and introduction so that they can get a little more familiar with you and your story?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm a polio survivor, 1956, and we'll probably get into that a little more. I missed the vaccinations by literally, like weeks or months, but and then grew up in Santa Barbara. I started a career shortly after that in radio. So I started in 1977 and, worked in radio up until just a few years ago. And then I retired and, just kind of still had that creative itch. And I missed, of all the things I did in radio, I missed doing the interviews. I did a community affairs report. And so I decided to start the podcast. Yeah, so Walk and Roll Live, and we essentially kind of do a lot like what you guys are doing. We interview people that have had injuries or all kinds of disabilities, CP, brain injuries, you name it, it's all over the place. And about 70% that, and then probably the other 30% is organizations that provide services and programs for individuals that have disabilities.
Oh, awesome.
Very nice. It's important and very needed. This community does not get enough attention and doesn't have enough resources where people can go and just learn about their situation, or can't say learn about their situation because, as we know, every situation is very unique
different.
And independent.
I used to call them snowflakes, but now I call them fingerprints.
There you go. Even more.
I stole that from somebody.
Yeah, no, it is because, like you said, there's just not enough resources, and everybody's just so different that if you can take, a couple pieces from here, a couple pieces from here, and piece it together, you might be able to understand a little bit more about yourself and your situation. So it's very important, and thank you for, being one of those resources for everybody.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. How much of your personal story do you feel like included you in wanting to start your podcast?
Well, one of the episodes was about me. I started in, I don't know if it was the first episode, but about 3 or 4 in, I told my story, and I had a co-host at the time, Eric, and we kind of told his whole story. And, then I told my brother's story. I haven't told you guys this, but me and my brother both got polio at the same time, same day, basically. Yeah, so, he's been kind of my partner in crime my whole life. So we told my story, which was cool because, of course, a lot of the story was the same because we grew up in the same family, but it was interesting to hear it from a different perspective. Yeah. So
I think that's a great segue into us getting into you and your story.
Ask away. I'm an open book.
Why don't you just give a brief overview of how it went? And
well, when I was born, 1955, there was no vaccination yet for polio. So, and they were working on it because there was epidemics every year, especially in cities with close populations.
Right.
Yeah, people were terrified of it, because it originally was called infantile paralysis because it generally would strike kids, but adults got it as well. And so they finally got a vaccination, but they were giving it to school-age kids first because things spread so much in school, right? So I was a year old. My brother was about 2 and 3 months, and so we didn't get it yet. But in that time, You know, we didn't get the vaccination yet, but in that time we got polio. Yeah, so one night I guess my mom put us to bed, you know, a couple of toddlers, and she came to get us the next morning, and we were in the same spot. You know, and anybody that has kids, you put a toddler to bed and you don't know what you're going to find in the morning. They're upside down, backwards.
Not in the same spot, you know.
Right.
That.
Exactly. So just grew up with it. And it's one of those things that we talk about on our podcast is, you know, and you guys probably run into this a lot in your work here at The Perfect Step. You know, you're dealing with people who probably have come to it through some kind of injury, SEI. And, right. You know, so not only are they dealing with the physical part of it, but they're dealing with the mental part of it, okay. Emotional part of it. You know, from one instance, you know, their life is going along. They've got the dreams. They've got all that things that they want to do in their life, married and all those things. Boom, and they just feel like that's gone in an instant. So I didn't really have to go through that, you know. So hopefully in telling our stories, especially with people that have gone through those things, it will help them. By the time they get to me, they've you know, pretty much gone through a lot of that. But I think I've learned through having the interviews that, you know, there's still periods where you kind of struggle with it. And I think people want to help others too that are coming up behind them and give them some input as well. Yeah. So,
I think there's a lot of people out there that want to help others just like yourselves, which is why you started the podcast in the first place. And,
you know, that's why when I got into radio, one of the very first things I got exposed to was, you know, we would do radiothons to raise money for different organizations, things like that. Well, my family had been helped by March of Dimes because they funded all the research for polio, for getting the vaccination. And once they got that and they eradicated polio pretty much, here was this whole fundraising organization that didn't have a purpose. And that's when they shifted to birth defects. And then we got help from Easter seals, you know, my family. And I'm not really sure entirely what the nature of it was, but, you know, probably financial partly and emotional and, you know, just that kind of support. So I took this vehicle in radio and kind of used it to give back, you know, from all that help that we got. So as a matter of fact, kind of a funny story, last year I went to Abilities Expo. So when first few years of my career, I was in San Luis Obispo, and I volunteered for the March of Dimes, and I befriended a family who their daughter was the poster child for the local March of Dimes. I don't think they have those anymore, but she was like 5 or 6 years old. And, you know, I knew them for a few years. I left the area, and last year at Abilities Expo, I went to the Abilities Expo. I interviewed one of the heads of Abilities Expo on the podcast. They tagged me. This gal now lives in Atlanta. She sees it, sees my name, reaches out to me and says, "Are you the same Doug Vincent who was a radio DJ in San Luis Obispo in the 80s? So I'm like, that is me. So now she's my co-host.
No way.
Yeah, so I had her on, you know, to tell her story.
That's so cool.
Which is a fascinating story. And then after a few months, my co-host at the time just got so busy that he couldn't do it anymore. So I asked her, and she said yes. So she's been doing it for a couple, 3 months.
Small world.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I think the Abilities Expo is great in many ways. That's not one of the direct ways that I would think that it helped a lot of people, but no, that's so cool. Are you going again this year?
Yeah. Gonna go on Friday.
What's your passion about radio? Like, what was in the first place you got into radio, and what kept you in that road for so long?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I have a hard time answering that, because I am the last person that you would ever think would get into radio. You know, when you talk about people that,
I don't know, you have a voice for it.
I did have the voice. I did.
Yeah, you do, really. Yeah. Like, when I think of,
good Lord bless me with that, because when it changed at 13 or 14, you know, people started immediately saying things like that. You know, you should be a DJ. Wow. And I'm thinking, well, these aren't professionals. They don't know. I didn't really take it too seriously. But I was a kind of kid, like a lot of us, you know, we don't want to get in front of class. People don't want to get in front of class, do an oral report. You know, it's the last thing you want to do. But I, on a number of occasions, would just, I'd be prepared and I'd just take the F, because I really didn't want to get up in front of Right. So then a buddy of mine I met working in another job, he said, "I've heard all about this broadcasting workshop down in LA, and you want to go down and audition?" And I'm, okay. So I went with him, and it's like it was meant to be. It was like a bug bit me that night, and I knew this is what I was going to do the rest of my life, and pursued it, after that. So, of course, then I'm presented with, I've got to overcome this, not being able to talk in front of people. So what I did real quick is, if somebody asked me, they hear I'm in radio and they say, hey, we got this event coming up, can you come and MC for us? And I would say yes before I thought about it, because I would say no if I had thought about it. And then I'd be petrified until the day of the event, and I just slowly but surely kind of got over that. So
do you think exposure and experience over time just helped you to get past some of those things? What were some methods or some techniques that you used beforehand in order to make yourself maybe a little less stressed or a little less nervous before being on?
I don't know, because it just was time mostly. Just because from the time I would say yes to an event to the time that I was doing the event might be 3 months. Well, at first, I was like just stressing about it that whole 3 months. Right. And then that time, slowly but surely, the more I did it, would get shorter and shorter. Now it gets to the point where even coming in here, it's a little heightened, anticipation. Yeah. But I know once I start going, I'll be fine.
Right. Definitely.
All the training and everything just kind of kicks in.
Yeah, you just let it happen, smooth sailing. Yeah. No, definitely. I can 100% agree with that too. And even the cameras sometimes get turned on, right? And it's a little bit different than, especially just being the audio for some purposes.
Yes.
But,
and that's the difference for me, because I've done radio for long. It's just the audio. So now you throw in another element, the cameras, and I start getting a little apprehensive about that. Yeah.
No, you definitely have a voice for it, like Cody said.
And I think both of us have a good ability to agree with you. You get that slight anticipation, and I'm sure if somebody went back and watched our very first podcast that we did and then watched us now, it's not saying we're great now by any means, but it was definitely robotic is what we got in the beginning, and I think we've come a long way in being able to relax in front of the camera and being able to actually have a conversation and create a
you feel it, right?
For sure. Yeah. I think a lot of stuff that helped us with that is just particular guests, not just the good ones, not just people like yourself who you get going and you get on a roll of a conversation, but even some of the ones who you're pulling teeth a little bit. Not saying we've had bad guests by any means, but some of the conversation, it's a little tougher to get somebody to open up. They're not just bubbly right off the start. They're not ready to share all the information. They make you ask a couple of questions, and then they give a little bit of an answer, and then you have to ask more follow-up questions and really try to get it out of them. And once you get in a couple of those situations, you're like, even if they don't want to give everything that we're trying to get out of them, we have the ability now to almost pull it out of them a little bit.
We're always trying to find ways to make them feel more comfortable. How can we make that guest to feel comfortable enough to share their story? Because a lot of these stories are not easy to share. I'm sure we would never know. We've never been through any type of thing similar to what they've been through. But if we can make somebody comfortable enough to share the deepest and darkest of stories that they've had, I think it's tremendous.
And do you find that those are the best? Sometimes those are the best stories.
Sometimes, for sure. Sometimes I think it's hard to say what's the best. With all the people that we've had on, we have certain conversations. I would say honestly, for myself, the first 15 or so podcasts we would record, and after the first one, I was like, okay, that was good. And then after the next one, that was the best one we've done. For the fifth one, that was the best one we've done. And through the first probably 20 every single time I was like, that's the best one we've done. That's the best one we've done. And even still, I get that.
They're to the best in their own ways, right? Depending on
and
what
that's
it was.
The fun part, when you're like I remember back in the beginning of my career, that learning curve is just so steep that from week to week you do hear that, and then the farther and farther you get into it, even though you're trying to hone your craft and get better and get better, those improvements are much more incremental and a little bit smaller, and it's harder and harder to notice them. But you just have to keep working on it.
And I think for us, we had no background in broadcasting, in video or radio or
talk show,
not even communications. Nothing. College, you give a couple 5-10 minute presentations where you stand in front of the class. And I don't know about him, but I hated it. I've always been, and even still, I'll find myself doing it. Even when we're doing the podcast, I I do some form of like a tick or
yeah.
a movement pattern, or if I was standing, I'd go up on my toes, go up on my heels, go up on my toes, or shift side to side. I would always have to be doing something with my physical body, so that I could.
Do you know corduroy pants? You know corduroy pants. I knew a guy when he would go on there, when he cracked the mic, he would rub his tops of his legs, and you could see it because right there. Right. He had rubbed all the corduroy off his pants. That's how much he did it.
Wow.
It was his nervous thing.
Just like what you said, the experience though, right? Of us just always doing it over and over and over again, finding that comfortable nature in it, but still trying to find ways to challenge ourselves to make it better all the time.
The Be Perfect Foundation is not just a name, it's a promise. A promise to individuals living with paralysis that they are not alone in their journey. Founded by Hal Hargrave Jr. in 2007, after his own life-altering accident, we are a nonprofit 501c3 organization dedicated to providing direct financial and emotional aid. Inspired by a quote from the movie Friday Night Lights, we believe that being perfect is about doing everything you can, especially for yourself, your family, and your friends. With nearly $10 million raised and a 100% volunteer staff, your support goes directly to those in need. We assist with medical supplies, wheelchairs, home adaptations, and exercise-based therapy programs. Our board of directors receives no salary, ensuring that almost every dollar donated makes a real impact. Visit BePerfectFoundation.org to donate or learn how you can get involved. The Be Perfect Foundation, changing perceptions daily.
So what advice would you give to us and how we can make this a better process?
That's probably the best advice right there is time. Really, it just, like people that get into it and they're only starting out and they're only doing it on weekends, it takes a lot of time. And especially since you got, like if you're doing weekends, you get a week in between where you kind of lose some momentum. So the more you do it is probably the biggest changer.
Definitely.
And listen, if you guys are listening to what you're doing and then you can hear the improvements.
Right. Or listens to it a lot. Listens to it quite a lot.
He definitely listens to it more than us, but I've noticed that as I watched like that, I start to understand what my filler words are, what I'm doing, how I communicate certain phrases. And
I still hear those on myself when I listen to mine.
I don't think they're ever really going to go away. I think you can do a little bit of a better job probably noticing them and thinking a little bit more before you do start to open your mouth. And I think something that's great with us is we have a co-host like you yourself. So it's not, if somebody responds, I don't have to be the one who immediately fills that blank space with a or a like or a, or a.
Well, and I imagine over the time you guys have gotten to know each other in doing, in doing this, that you have cues that you don't even have to even look at them. You just knows where you're going to jump in and you kind of sense it now.
We go decently far back too. It kind of helped with that connection a little bit more. We've known each other for almost 8 years now. 8 years. We played baseball at University of Laverne together, so that's how we have that connection.
Roommates for 4 years, very, very close.
So you got a foundation there.
Yes, however, I think it made definitely the connection better as far as being on the podcast and nonverbal cues. But I think still we're always trying to make that better as co-hosts too, and make the other person feel more comfortable or understand who's trying to answer the question, who's trying to speak at a particular time. So always trying to find time to make that better too. But Doug, I do have a question for you in regards to being a radio talk host. When you started that, what year was that and where did you start?
1977.
Okay.
And I remember it was a Labor Day weekend. Oh no, that was the second job because the first job only lasted 4 nights. That was my first time ever on a commercial radio station. It was in a motel. So, you know how in an old motel they have all the rooms lined. This is a 1-story motel. All the rooms are lined up. Well, they had taken the doors out of all the adjoining doors between them. So you could just walk from room to room to room to room all the way down. So one room was a control room. Next room was a production room. Next one was a newsroom. Next one was, whatever. And it was terrible. But, and I'll tell you, this is the funny story. So this was in Santa Maria, California.
Okay.
I grew up in Santa Barbara, and my brother still lived there. So it's just, 30 to 90 minutes you could listen to this radio station where I was. So my brother and his friend, they come up over the hill and they're listening to me. They listen to the first break. I'm doing midnight to 6 or something in the morning. Wow. And they listen to the first break and they kind of look at each other like, well, let's go get breakfast at Denny's and maybe when we get back, he won't suck so much. Yeah. So it's like, hey, I love that story because I did. I was horrible.
What did
You
it
know.
entail? Like, what were you talking about?
It was,
when you say you sucked, was
It's
the
what they call an
content bad?
album-oriented format, And I have no idea what the hell I was talking about. We could get into a long discussion about all these things, but they didn't really have any formatics I can remember. I mean, every place I ever worked after that had very concise ways of rotating the music. And that's a whole science in and of itself. Now you have computers that help you with it. But I just remember, because I'm playing album cuts. When you go to a more commercial radio station, you're playing songs that maybe are 3 minutes long, and the album cuts are longer, 4 or 5 minutes. This is rock and roll. And I just remember somehow I get to the end of the record, and I was barely getting the next song on. I'm like, what could take me 5 minutes to do that? But it's just, you're just not good at it. So you learn all those things, And I transitioned into country music where there were records literally that were like less than 2 minutes long. And you were queuing everything up on records, and doing all those things. So, so I got much better at it over the years. But that first night was a nightmare. And the program director, he came to me after the third night and he says, "You suck," basically, in so many words. And he said, "If you don't do better tonight, then you're done." So I went back in there and kind of angry, because, he hired me knowing this was the first time I'd ever been on a commercial radio station. So, but the good thing was with that anger, I kind of threw caution to the wind and I just did what I thought was the best job I could at the time. Right. And I was satisfied with it. And if he let me go, I don't care. So he let me go. Yeah. So then I went to San Luis Obispo, and I have a lot of relatives there. So I hadn't visited them in a while. So I went and was visiting them and was talking to my aunt and uncle who owned a motorcycle dealership. And they said, well, the owner of the station is our rep. When he comes in, we can give him a tape and resume for you. I'm like, okay. And I got a part-time job there, and kind of the rest is history. It just took off. Worked 4 years there, went 4 years to another radio station there, then came down here in '85.
What was your favorite job you did?
The favorite place I worked in, just the way they ran it and all of that, was KGGI. I don't know if you're familiar with KGGI locally here, 99.1.
I'm not. I'm from Northern California.
Okay. Yeah, but just a great bunch of people. Yeah, very supportive. From management on down. And that was like a year and a half that I was there. And then I was at K-Frog for 24 years, which was...
Oh, really?
Yeah, a long time.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
what brought you down here to more Southern California in 1985?
I worked with a couple of guys at the second radio station that I worked in San Luis Obispo. And they came down here as a general manager and a sales manager. And they said, all right, when we get everything straightened out, we'll bring you down. So I came down, kind of checked it out, and came about a year later and worked there for 6 years before I left that place. Yeah.
Do you have like a DJ name?
The first night that I went into that first radio station, I was going to call myself Doug James. James is my middle name. But the guy, I can't remember now if it was the guy that I was relieving, which I didn't know because I, never heard of the station or anything. I get there and his name was Bob James. So I couldn't be Doug James, and I didn't think of anything else, so I just went with Doug Vincent. So most of my career, it was Doug Vincent, or all of it except for K-Frog. K-Frog, it was Doug E. Frog. Yeah, so.
That's cool. Did any of your friends ever call you DJ growing up? Doug James, I mean, you're made to be a DJ.
Yeah. No. As much as you might think there be that connection, no.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So K-Frog sounds like it was a really good experience for you, too.
Yeah,
you were there for a really long time.
Yeah. I worked with a lot of great people, made a lot of great friends.
Are you in the retail, restaurant, hospitality, or petroleum industry? Looking for a trusted partner with your multi-site remodel, refresh, or tech integration needs? Look no further. Apex Imaging Services is your complete solution provider. With over 7 decades of experience, we're experts in everything from general contracting to cutting-edge tech solutions. Visit apeximagingservices.com to learn how we can transform your business, increase efficiency, and elevate your brand. Apex Imaging Services. Your vision, our expertise.
If you were going to give advice, I know we talked about time already and experience within this realm, but if we were to give advice to anybody that, let's just say per se, they have a disability and they have a physical disability, but they want to get into some form of finding confidence in order to be a radio talk host or finding a way to be on some form of a broadcasting, what advice would you give to that person?
That's a interesting question. Because I'm not even sure where I got it. I just had the confidence in myself, and I think it's interesting because now in my retirement, I'm reflecting about that. You hear about people follow your dream. If you have a dream, it helps you get through the tough times.
Right.
Well, I never kind of looked at it that way until now, and looking back on it, I did have a dream. I just didn't. I didn't label it that way, I don't think, because there's many times, when there were some real roadblocks and hurdles, in my career, but I never once thought about giving up, for the whole time. I just kind of kept going forward, and I just believe in yourself, and work hard at your craft, like I was telling you guys, listening to your podcast. You can't hear what you need to work on while you're doing it, so you have to go back and listen to those tapes, and that's when you really make leaps and bounds, and you're always thinking. I mean, I always think about it, because I did a lot of production as well in addition to on-air work. So I would listen to, especially in the early days, I would listen to guys that did incredible production, and then I would try to duplicate what they did. And not to steal their style, but just to see if I could produce that kind of sound. And I don't know if I did it their way, probably didn't do it the way they did, but I had to come up with my own way, Right. One of the first things when I was still a part-timer, and there was going to be a staff meeting at the first radio station that I was at, that I was there eventually 4 years, I went to a program director and said, yeah, sure, come. So I came to the meeting, and one of the things he told the staff, the full-time staff, when you come in, there's going to be like newspaper clippings in your inbox, and at least every day I want you to write a commercial, and what they call that is a spec to give to the salespeople to go out and try to sell that client on the radio station. And I remember as a kid, with no experience whatsoever, I'm thinking, I can't imagine having to do a commercial a day, So I went down at night to the local stores and just looked in the window and was taking notes of what they sold. And then I came back and wrote a commercial and produced it and never played it for anybody. That was just for me to give myself the confidence that I could do it in the event that somebody came to me and said, you got to do a commercial a day. I wanted to know in my mind that I was ready. So that helped me do that. So, those kinds of things, wherever you can draw on that to give yourself confidence.
That's great advice. Yeah. If anyone wanted to reach out to you personally in order to maybe a mentorship or someone wanted to talk to you about...
You just Google my name.
Okay.
Yeah, because I've got a website. I've got a couple of different websites. I have one that's for all my production stuff, which is Productions. Productions.
Love it.
And then Walk and Roll Live, and my phone number is all over them and all that. So
very nice.
Yeah.
If
I go to bed at 4:30 though, so don't call me too late.
We're past your bedtime right now.
No, we're getting there.
If somebody was in the process community and they were looking into broadcasting or video production or something like that, because it is a reasonably accessible field, and you were starting now, what type of parts of that would you be trying to get into? Would it be radio? Would it be production? Would it be video production?
I that's a tough one to answer because the landscape has changed so much in radio. When I left radio, I never even thought about looking for another radio job because easily for the last 10 years, the labor force has been shrinking in radio. Steadily. I mean, you probably hear it in the news where iHeartRadio has gotten rid of 200 more people, and you hear that weekly and some of the other big conglomerates like that. So there are tons and tons of talented people out there, every bit, probably more than me, and we're all looking for the same jobs. And on top of that, I didn't want to leave this area, and I would want to make a certain amount of money. So, you add all those things up, and it would be a very small. So, and then the technology has really impacted radio. So when I got in, every radio station, the little radio station that I worked for in San Luis Obispo, had a full-time news director and a part-time news person. And, they had a production director, they had air staff live all the way around the clock, at weekenders, all of those things. Well, now that same amount of people can do 5 or 10 radio stations. There are people in this market, Riverside, San Bernardino, that are voice tracking stations for the same company, say, in San Diego or Texas or other places. And the jocks in those cities are voice tracking here, so they get different voices. They have computer programs that, you maybe listen to somebody that did the voice tracks, the jock part of it, did it yesterday or 2 weeks ago. So,
do you feel like AI is taking up some of the jobs that could have been there if AI wasn't a thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just, you're just, I talk about doing one commercial a day. I ended up doing 20 and 30 a day,
Wow.
later in my career when I got to a station that was very, very busy. I mean, they're not all complicated and detailed ones, but yeah, you could do 20, 30 pieces of production a day easily. So I don't know, to today's broadcasters, I wonder, I was having that conversation with a buddy of mine, if you're getting in now, because there's so many other mediums, you've got the satellite radios, you've got podcasts, all of those things, which I think are great because you own them yourself and you're making the ratings or the revenue yourself. Right. So I don't know what the future of radio is. I mean, it's been going downhill. It feels like since I got in, they were saying the AM radio's over. When I got in 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's
streaming
to the point
services
where that may not be too far off, So I don't know.
I think the ability to have a library of the exact music that a particular person wants to listen to versus having to listen to the radio with the commercials
without interruptions,
and it's music that you might like this song, you might not like the next song. They could play 2-3 songs in a row that you don't like, and you're kind of taking that chance on it. I do think there's a niche when it comes to certain components that are guest involved on the radio. One of the big ones that I grew up with was, I'm going to botch the name. Not even going to try to remember. It was, I think, Charlie's Roses or something like that, where a guy would call and deliver roses for somebody. Something like that.
I vaguely remember that.
Something like that. Another one is the impossible question of the day. I think that one's on K-Frog. Stuff that interacts with them and gives you...
So, and that's what happens, the radio stations, they have a morning show that has the freedom to do those kinds of things and interact. And then the rest of the day is just music and text.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and we used to do some fun things. I couldn't take the time to do something like that. But when I was at K-Frog, I could put listeners on the air, but it would be 8 to 10 seconds. So every time I got a phone call, I'd roll tape, and every once in a while you get that nugget. Somebody would just say something in a funny way or ask you a silly question, or you could answer it in a silly way, and then you'd put it on and keep people entertained. But
that's a big thing, I guess, that AI is never going to bring is personality. Yeah. Right? You can't beat personality.
Not from my experience. Yeah. I mean, I use it a little bit, for the podcast to have different voices and stuff. But to me, I can tell, and I think most people can tell. Where it's difficult is to have attitude.
Right.
Yeah. It's great. You can just use it. If you want an announcer's voice to give you a straight delivery, that's fine. But
but not everyone wants that just clear and cut. There needs to be, like you said, some attitude, some charisma to it. And I think that's where it kind of separated. It seemed like almost they did the beginning, the Ryan's Roses thing you're talking about. that was like on the way to work for a lot of people, right? So a lot of people were going to work during that time, calling in, having a funny personality, and then they may even get some popularity from that, and then music the rest of the day. So it's kind of interesting how Bluetooth, USB, Apple Music, Spotify kind of took some of those things away.
Too many.
But, but it's great to have the freedom of being able to do a podcast for free, right? To be able to sit here and do something like this, and to be able to have Walk and Roll Live. It's a blessing to be able to do something like that.
Love it, yeah. It gets me up in the morning.
How do you think the content is different in being able to host your own podcast and have a conversation that is, it's not at length because it's an hour. That's an at length conversation, but it's not 3-4 hours or however long some of the really long podcasts are, or however long, if you go out to a bar with some of your friends and have a conversation, whatever it is. But how's it been different for you doing an hour long conversation, kind of getting into some more of the nitty gritty stuff versus being on air and you said an 8-second snippet to somebody?
That's it. They want you to say the callers. They only want you to talk over the intro. And by the time you say the call letters, you can't say anything meaningful after that in 18 seconds. That's a long one of an intro. So, so that's the nice thing, is to having the freedom just to have long form conversations and, ask the questions I want to ask. And, I think it's the 40 to 50 years that I did it. It's hard for me to be like anything racy or anything like that, even have any kind of saucy language. It's hard for it to even come out of my mouth just because I couldn't for so long.
Right.
Right.
What do you
I don't think it's necessary. But,
what do you thoroughly enjoy better now that you're doing the podcast? Do you enjoy the podcast a little bit more, or is it in different ways, you'd say?
I think, when I did that community affairs report, that was like the last 5 years of my career. So I had done on air and production, which I really love production and all that. And when they asked me to do it, I said no. And then they offered me a raise, and I said yes. And, but I hated it. And mostly I hated the fact that corporate wanted a report every quarter. So I had to, keep track of all those, because I did like 2 or 3 interviews a week, every week, year round. So I would have to take those and do a quarterly report, and I hated that part of it. And I didn't realize this, but after I retired, that's what I started to miss. Was the interviews, not the report. And I had actually started the podcast about 10 or 11 years before, and I just set it aside because I couldn't keep up with doing it once a week. So I told myself 2 things: is I don't want to start it again until I can do it consistently once a week, and I want to get a co-host. So I found somebody to do that. I had the studio at my house, so I could do it once a week, and away we went. So we relaunched it in May of 2023. And so I didn't know. It kind of came out of left field that's what I missed, the thing I hated. And so that's it. I love that, and I love putting it all together. Still the production part of it, and putting it all together. Yeah.
Being able to look at that thing that you created at the end of it.
Yeah.
I'm sure I would call it a form of art, just like any artist.
I do.
I'm sure not a lot of them are too fond of the process, but when you get to look at the thing that you created in the end, it's a good feeling.
Especially, because I was having this conversation too with somebody recently, is that, when you're producing commercials, it's hard to look at it as art. But, and I did, in addition to doing commercials, I did what they call imaging for the station. So it's all those things that are between songs or out of the commercials into songs, little buzzes and, zaps and all that, and the call letters. I'd do something 10 seconds long, and I might spend 30 minutes on it. And I'm not kidding, just making it perfect for something that nobody gives a crap about.
Those are some like intrinsic things though that not a lot of people pay attention to, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like looking at a commercial in a different lens on TV. So you may see that as just another normal commercial, but then when you look at those fine little things, the background music, the intermission in between, it just kind of makes it different for you. It's a different experience in a different light because you kind of see all the little small things as opposed to just seeing something on the screen and not thinking too much about it.
And that's what you put into it. You get a client, you read the commercial, and it kind of speaks to you. You see it's going to have a certain attitude. So you're not going to do a fine diamond commercial like you would do the monster truck commercial.
Right.
you know, and vice versa, really, you know.
Right.
So you have to find the right music, give it the right delivery, all of those things, yeah.
Did you guys ever play into the role when you were doing the radio into target audience? Was that ever a conversation of you guys of what kind of audience you're trying to target?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What was it? And
It was very specific from radio station to radio station. I mean, we would even have do like a bio of what our target listener. You know, one station, it was like a 28-year-old single mom with 1.75 kids. I mean,
wow.
Yeah, it's like that's your target audience.
Very specific.
Yeah. And so when you did research, like one radio station, you know, they'd have us ask the age. Well, they wouldn't have us, no, let's see. How do they do it? We'd have to ask their age. And the young kids, I don't know how they got this in their head. When we asked that, I guess they thought we wouldn't play their song unless they were old enough. So they would say, you know, I'm 18, you know, and you could tell,
Yeah.
you know, you're not 18.
Yeah.
So, you know, we would say things like, well, when's your birthday? And they would know that. Well, they wouldn't know their birthday to be 18. So that would trip them up sometimes. And then they started to figure that out. So they figured out what their birthday was for when they were 18. And then you have to come up with a follow-up question. You know, so what year did you graduate? And then that would trip them up. Yeah. But they wanted to know for research, you know, when certain people were asking for certain songs. And, yeah. You know, what the age of the person, male or female, obviously, and all that. Yeah, so very important. Yeah, especially because each radio station is going for a particular audience, and the coveted one is 25-54, if it still is, because that's what they call age of acquisition. You know, between 25 and 54, that's when you're buying furniture for your house and washers and dryers and stuff for your kids and a car and a boat and a house and all those things. So that's the audience that's spending all that money.
Love it.
Are you or a loved one living with paralysis and searching for a path to recovery and hope? Look no further than The Perfect Step. Our unique exercise-based recovery programs have helped clients with conditions like spinal cord injury, stroke, Parkinson's, and more. With our approach, many clients experience improved function, reduced medication, and even freedom from wheelchairs. But we're not just a program. We're a community of support. You'll meet peers who understand your journey, along with specialists dedicated to your recovery. Visit us today at theperfectstep.com. The Perfect Step, where recovery begins.
Kind of switching pages a little bit here. I want to hear more, if you can, if you're willing.
Yep.
Kind of about your diagnosis, and you're someone that's been in a chair pretty much your entire life. Is that true, or is that not true?
So when we got diagnosed with polio, we were in the hospital for months before we got to come home. You know, quarantined and through whatever recovery was like there. Then we came home, and you know, those early years, I don't know what that was like. As far as I know, I was just a kid. We had braces and crutches. So my brother and I, we walked. And then at some point, I'm just trying to figure this out here recently, looking at some old pictures and stuff, because we were in San Luis Obispo, and then we moved to Santa Barbara because my parents had found that there was places in Santa Barbara we could get more treatment.
Right.
So they moved the family to Santa Barbara. And then we had a series of surgeries to get us off the brace. Each of my brother and I have a dominant side. My right side is stronger, his left side is stronger. So I eventually got down to just one brace on my left leg.
Nice.
And then around maybe 45 to somewhere between 45 and 50, my shoulder just started barking at me, you know, and, you know, slowly but surely I got to the point where I could still go like to a Disneyland or go to the fair and walk around all day, but it kicked my ass, you know, so I would take 2 and 3 days to recover. So one time we went to the fair, a buddy of mine and I, and he made a joke, I think, you know, have all the larks, they're called larks, the little scooters lined up, and said, you ought to rent a lark, you know. That's not a bad idea, you know. So we went and rented it, and it changed my life in magical ways. You know, got around, just got all over the place, probably saw more, and I didn't have to recover so much after that. I immediately went to the doctor, got a prescription, for a wheelchair. I got my first wheelchair, which I started just using it for things like that, long day things. And then slowly but surely over the last 20 years, up until probably it took the first 10 years, and about somewhere between 8 and 10 years ago, I switched to the chair pretty much full time. Yeah, because these are just gone, my shoulders.
Right. How old were you at that time when you were getting into the Lark? How old were you when you
That
found
was probably like 45.
Okay, 45.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And so somebody that's been experienced in, finding chairs and trying to find out what works best for you, is there somebody that you go to, a place that you recommend as far as?
The first chair that I got, I don't know if I got lucky. I think it was part lucky. They measure you. You know how it is.
Yeah.
They measure. I've never been measured for anything as much as a chair. And I loved my first chair. And I had it for 10 or so years. And I was looking for something lighter, so I got another one. And it was all wrong. And I had it for 10 years. And it just, there were so many things about it that I would change. So I just got this one about 3 months ago. So I was very intentional about different things that I wanted when I got this one, and I love this one.
Great.
Yeah. So I think about. I mean, for the first one, it's tough because you don't really know. I don't think what you want, but especially the second one. Think about what the first one's like and how it's serving you and what things that you don't like about it, and, ask to change it and have it more specific to you and your needs. Yeah.
Definitely.
Would you say that, was it a hard transition for you to go from?
In some ways, it's, your pride is involved in that. And, so like I say, I used it just for, long trips, or long day walking type things at first. But then, you get to the point where the walking deteriorated so much that being in the chair is the only place you felt agile. So then that kind of, for me at least, it drew me to the chair. I enjoyed the chair more than walking. Walking was, I put it off just because I didn't want to be in the chair all the time. And there's certain benefits to walking too. You're still using those muscles. I'm still using my core a lot when you're walking on crutches. So there was benefits to it. So I didn't want to, get out of it too early. But
You mentioned about your therapy process when you were young. What did that look like for you? You said your mom started you and your brother in therapy back in San Luis Obispo.
Well, we went to, when we got to Santa Barbara, we went to a school. It was only 2 rooms, so there was one room that was kindergarten till 5th or 6th, and then the other classroom was 7th to seniors. So they had to try to, there was probably 20 or 30 of us in the class, so they had to try to teach all those grades within the same class. But we also had physical therapy during the course of the day and occupational therapy as well. All, inclusive in that school day. Yeah.
Do you know if there's programs out there still like that?
I don't know. I've gone back to Santa Barbara to visit that place, and I've read up on it, and it continued for quite a while. Now I think they provide that kind of service within the public school now more. Yeah. Because we got what they called at the time mainstreamed. Both my brother and I in 5th grade, we went to public school. And, we were just, we were very ambulatory. So there was we didn't have to have special classes. We got to high school. I remember, they made some accommodations for us, which were horrible, for PE, which is basically, let's just go sitting for 45 minutes in the weight room, just talking, to one another. So,
What was physical therapy like for you and occupational therapy? Which one did you enjoy more, and what was that process like for you?
Well, I think if I remember, it's a long time ago. I remember liking occupational therapy more. Occupational therapy, at least the way they were doing it, was, more stretching and different things like that. I remember them they would put ice on our feet to stimulate something. By this time, 8, I was like 5, 6, 7, 8 at that time.
Gotcha.
And other ways of stimulating our muscles. And
Yeah.
so I don't know what the whole philosophy was behind it, or if there was, how much science had been, was in it to know what the outcomes were and all that. But
through a lot of your different experiences that you've kind of touched on today, you've addressed a commitment to learning and really getting good at whatever you're doing. And I think that kind of really showed when you were talking about radio and your ability to go from somebody who, as you said in the beginning, was not very good at it or even sucked, to being able to work through that and get to the point to where you're able to do it as a profession for your entire career. Where do you think that commitment to learning came from?
I think I think somewhere along the path, maybe watching my dad. He was a guy that worked. He had a great work ethic. There were times when he had maybe 2 or 3 jobs. We weren't. We were lower middle class, probably something like that. But he always made it work. So I think I saw that example. If you're going to do something, do it right. I can remember if I didn't get it from him, verbally, I certainly got it, from him by example. But I remember hearing that message, from teachers or whatever, and that resonated with me. I felt like if I'm going to do something, I'm going to put my all into it. I'm not going to half-ass it, So I think that was a big part of it. And I recognized that, and this, I remember this quote, and I don't remember, I think it was a teacher. I can't remember specifically who it was, but, and I think everybody has heard this at some point or another, but, you only get out of something as much as you put in. And that really stuck with me. That's probably one of those things that has guided me in everything I do. Yeah.
Does that even coincide now, you feel like, to your podcast nowadays? Whatever you put into is what you're going to get out of it. Yeah. Do you feel like that is even, though, with the same kind of similar with that also? Do you feel like the production outweighs the recordings, or how does that feel?
Well, yeah, it's something I struggle with it a lot because, of course, I wanted to grow as far as listenership and all those things.
Right.
And I feel like I'm putting out a product that warrants that. But at the same time, I have to be, you were talking about audience before, what does the audience want? I don't think they really, and listening to other podcasts, and no offense, just this my career, I grew up in things like, mic techniques and, making sure levels are good and, make sure, you guys have got a great little spot here where you've obviously thought about sound deadening and all that. In some of these podcasts, it's like, could you get a bigger bathroom to get in? It's like, I hate to say that, but audio wise, it's just, they sound horrible. But they could be the #1 podcast, in that category. Yeah. So it doesn't mean anything. So I can't bend the world to me, what I think should be the best, So
Is that frustrating sometimes?
It's frustrating a little bit. Yeah.
Because,
and not so much frustrating as I'm not getting there is I'm trying to learn, because
how to adapt.
Yeah. How do I adapt to this? Great. I did radio for all those years. There's a whole, even though it's so similar, it's still so much different. And I have a lot to learn, and I want to learn that, and I'm open to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of something we touched on was, the reason we started this podcast was to be an educational resource for people living with a form of paralysis. And something we kind of try to touch on with each of those episodes is, you've been through a lot, that experience yourself. What types of pieces of advice would you give to those individuals who maybe are new to the community? Maybe they're 10, 15 years in and they're thinking, nothing is going to get better from here. I've hit my peak, but as I'm sure there's always the next peak. Like there might be a valley, but there's going to be the next peak. What kind of advice would you give to them?
I hope this speaks to that. Over the course of just the last almost 2 years doing this, fairly early on, it dawned on me, because this is it's a traumatic event in someone's life. And I realized that I'm talking to the people that have made it, in that they've overcome the psychological part, not the healing, physical healing part, because, there's plenty of people that do that. And there's plenty of services like, yours that that help people with that, and in the medical field. But it's the people, I got to thinking about where are all the people that I don't see and we don't know about that are isolated somewhere, who post-injury, it could be 2, 3, 10 years post-injury, and they're still haven't come out, and they're mentally they haven't made that transition. And how do you reach them? I'm looking for a way to reach them, because in a few of the episodes that I've had where somebody was that person and they got out, it was going to a support group. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is to embrace this community, because it's a almost instant connection that I've seen with people that get out and get into this community, go to an adaptive sports fair, go to a Triumph mixer or
Abilities Expo.
Really, yeah, those are your people, and they get you immediately. Rolling Start has wheelchair support groups, a couple of them every month, and it's 20 and 30 people strong, and it's amazing to especially see the people that had been isolated and they come out and they start to flourish. It's awesome. Yeah.
That's great insight. Thanks for sharing that. And around TPS lately, we've been focusing on people have been reinventing their life, or I've seen someone reinvent their life. So how have you done that yourself, Doug? How have you seen somebody, or how have you done that?
Well, that's another thing I've learned is that, you don't lose your personality when you have an injury. If you're a thrill seeker, you're still a thrill seeker. You just have to find those thrills somewhere else. Through adaptive sports is one of those ways that you can get out there and get that fix, if you will. So whatever it is, for you, whatever that, whatever your personality was before the injury, be true to yourself and pursue those things that you wanted to afterwards. Just because your mode of transportation or being mobile has changed, that doesn't mean you've changed in any way. You can still pursue those things. You might have to adapt, So, that's one of the reasons how I found myself, in radio, is because as I grew, when I was in my teenage years and getting to that closer and closer to that age of going out on my own, thinking, I got to figure out something to make a living. And it's very easy to start knocking things off the list. So I can't do that. I can't. The heavy lifting, that's out. All those things are out. And then what's left, and I really was at an age where I hadn't found anything yet. I was 20 or 21 and was, working an electronic assembly job. And I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do the rest of my life. So when radio presented itself, I was just a fertile mind, I think, and open to what the possibilities were. And this is something I could do. And if I may, kind of touch on the accessibility in radio. I never felt like I missed out on an opportunity because I was disabled. I feel like I contributed. I had something to contribute, to the employer. And that's all they're looking for, is somebody that can do the job that they have for you. And I was able to do that. And I don't think I wondered sometimes, but I don't think that I was ever just fulfilling a quota, for any employer. I think, because there were times when, management would change and new management would come in and they would clear house, and I made that transition more times than I didn't. Because I had 2 or 3 different things that I could offer. And that was by, design. I did that on purpose. I knew I was a DJ, and then I worked on doing production because I knew when somebody came in, I could do radio, I could on air, I could do production, whereas this person over here, all he does is DJ, doesn't do really any production.
Right.
They'll go, we can get 2 for the price of 1, basically.
You had a lot of tools in your toolbox, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly.
As you still do. Well, Doug, thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure to have you on. It sounds like you have so much valuable insight to share, and we're excited to be on your Walk and Roll Live pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Looking forward to that.
It'll be my turn.
Yeah, exactly. You'll get to be the one asking us the questions. No, like you said, thank you for coming on and sharing your insight with our audience, and we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of Pathways to Healing, the Perfect Step podcast.
Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, share, and feel free to leave a review by clicking the link in the description below.
If you have any feedback or topics you'd like for us to cover in upcoming episodes, go to our website under the tab Pathways to Healing and fill out that form.
Until then, keep inspiring, stay resilient, and roll on.